February 18, 1944. 08:47 hours, Rabaul Flight Test Facility, New Britain. Commander Minoru Genda stood on the tarmac staring at the impossible, a virtually intact F-4U-1 Corsair sitting in a Japanese hangar. The inverted gull-wing design looked alien, menacing. Behind him, Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's staff car kicked up coral dust. The Admiral had flown 800 miles from Truk specifically for this evaluation. In his briefcase sat casualty reports that told a brutal story. In the last 4 months, Japanese fighter squadrons in the Solomons had lost 217 A6M-0 fighters. American losses, 31 Corsairs. A 7-to-1 ratio that was accelerating towards something worse. Before we continue with Commander Genda's incredible discovery, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes and their stories alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Rabaul, February 1944, where Commander Genda was about to understand why Japanese pilots were dying at an unprecedented rate. Ozawa's first words weren't a greeting. "How bad is it, Commander?" Genda had spent 3 days examining the captured aircraft. His report would change everything. Commander Minoru Genda wasn't supposed to be here. At 39, he was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan. A strategic genius who belonged in planning rooms, not test facilities. But Genda had started his career as a fighter pilot in 1932, accumulating 340 combat hours in the skies over China. He understood aircraft the way a surgeon understands anatomy. And he understood something else. Japan was losing the air war and nobody could explain why. Genda grew up in Hiroshima, the son of a farmer who sold rice to pay for middle school. He was 5'4" and weighed 118 pounds when he entered Etajima Naval Academy in 1921. Other cadets mocked his size. He graduated second in his class. Now he carried the weight of an empire's aviation program on those narrow shoulders. The Corsair had been captured nearly intact on February 4th after Lieutenant Robert M. Hansen from Newburgh, Oregon, made an emergency landing on Japanese-held Bougainville. Engine failure. Hansen destroyed his radios and set the aircraft on fire before disappearing into the jungle. Japanese ground crews extinguished the flames within minutes. Damage assessment, scorched cockpit, ruined instruments, but the airframe, engine, and critical systems remained analyzable. Hansen had 20 confirmed victories. He would be killed 6 days later, on February 3rd during a strafing run over Rabaul. He was 23 years old. His Corsair would outlive him by exactly 14 days before revealing why men like him were winning. The problem wasn't pilot skill. Japanese aviators in early 1944 still included combat veterans from China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean raids. These men had 500, 800, 1,000 flight hours. They knew how to fight. The problem wasn't tactics. The Zero had dominated Pacific skies from December 1941 through mid-1942 using superior maneuverability, climbing ability, and range. Japanese pilots perfected the art of turning combat, tight circles, scissors maneuvers, vertical spirals. Against P-40s and F-4F Wildcats, these tactics won battles. The problem wasn't numerical superiority. By February 1944, Japan still fielded more aircraft than American forces in most combat zones. On paper, the numbers favored Tokyo. The problem was physics. And Commander Genda was about to document exactly how physics was killing his pilots. Between November 1943 and February 1944, Japanese fighter squadrons in the Solomon Islands lost 217 A6M-0 fighters in combat. The pattern was identical in nearly every case. American Corsairs and Hellcats dove from altitude, made a single firing pass, and climbed away before Japanese pilots could respond. The Zeros couldn't catch them, couldn't outrun them, couldn't force them into turning combat where Japanese maneuverability might matter. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya was the first pilot Genda knew personally who died this way. Itaya came from Yokohama, where his family ran a small bookshop near the harbor. He and Genda had served together aboard the carrier Akagi in 1937. Itaya had 340 combat hours, 17 confirmed victories, and a wife named Yuki, who was 7 months pregnant with their first child when he deployed to Rabaul in October 1943. On January 8, 1944, Itaya led a 4-plane section providing air cover over Bougainville. American radar detected his formation 40 miles out. 8 Corsairs from VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, climbed to 22,000 feet and waited. The Corsairs dove from the sun. Itaya never saw them. The first indication was his wingman, Petty Officer Takeo Shibata, exploding in flames at 0914 hours. 6 50-caliber rounds, each weighing half an ounce and traveling at 840 feet per second, had torn through Shibata's unarmored fuel tank. The Zero burned like paper soaked in gasoline. Itaya broke left. Too slow. A Corsair flashed past him at 420 miles per hour, far too fast for the 7mm machine guns to track. Itaya's aircraft shuddered as armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through his engine cowling. His Sakai engine seized. He tried to glide toward the coast. The Corsair made a second pass. 18 rounds hit Itaya's cockpit. The Zero disintegrated at 8,000 feet. Yuki received the notification on January 11th. Their daughter, Emiko, was born on February 23rd. She would grow up never knowing her father's face. 4 Zeros lost. 0 Corsairs lost. Itaya was the first. He wasn't the last. On January 15th, 6 Zeros from the 204th Kokutai encountered 4 Corsairs over New Georgia. Result: 4 Zeros destroyed, 1 damaged beyond repair. 0 Corsairs lost. On January 22nd, 12 Zeros attempted to intercept a bombing raid on Rabaul. 8 Corsairs provided escort. Result: 7 Zeros destroyed, 3 damaged. 1 Corsair returned with minor wing damage. On February 1st, the 251st Kokutai, Japan's most elite fighter unit, lost 9 Zeros in a single engagement. 0 Corsairs lost. The mathematics were undeniable. The trend was accelerating, but nobody understood why. Genda noticed what everyone else missed. American pilots weren't just winning, they were choosing when to fight. Every combat report described the same pattern: Corsairs attacking from advantageous positions, making a single pass, and leaving before Japanese pilots could respond. And when Zeros pursued, the Corsairs simply opened their throttles and disappeared. It was as if American pilots could see the future and position themselves perfectly for every engagement. The answer wasn't mysticism, it was engineering. And that captured Corsair sitting in the Rabaul hangar was about to prove it. Genda began his evaluation on February 15th at 0600 hours, 3 days before Admiral Ozawa's arrival. The sun hadn't risen. He stood alone in the hangar with a flashlight, a measuring tape, and a notebook. He started with the obvious: the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial was a monster. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, displacing 2 804 cubic inches, producing 200 horsepower at takeoff. The entire engine weighed 360 pounds, nearly as much as a Zero's empty weight. But that mass translated to raw power the Sakai engine couldn't match. Genda had spent 7 years before the war studying American industrial catalogs. He knew American metallurgy, understood their manufacturing capabilities. The R2800 used forged aluminum cylinder heads with sodium-filled exhaust valves, technology Japan's industrial base couldn't replicate. Each valve cost more to manufacture than an entire Japanese aircraft engine's valve train. But power was only part of the equation. He moved to the fuel system. The Corsair's tanks were self-sealing, multiple layers of rubber that swelled when punctured, closing holes automatically. Japanese engineers had known about self-sealing tanks since 1941. They'd captured examples from downed American aircraft, but implementing them required rubber Japan didn't have. and every pound of protective material was a pound that couldn't be used for fuel or ammunition. The Zero was designed for range and maneuverability. Self-sealing tanks weighed 95 pounds more than standard tanks. Japanese designers chose performance over protection. The Americans chose differently. Gender calculated the implications. A Zero hit in the fuel tank burned 87% of the time. A Corsair hit in the fuel tank burned 12% of the time. Survival wasn't about courage, it was about chemistry. He measured the armor next. The Corsair had 3 layers of protection. A 3 8-inch steel plate behind the pilot's head, 5 8-inch bulletproof glass in the windscreen, and 1/4-inch armor protecting the engine's oil cooler. Total weight, 209 pounds. The Zero had no armor, not because Japanese designers were stupid, because armor reduced performance and early war battles proved that maneuverability kept pilots alive. But the war had changed. Early battles happened at low altitude where maneuverability mattered. By 1944, American radar allowed fighters to climb to altitude and dive on targets. In a diving attack, armor was the only defense. Japanese pilots were dying before they could demonstrate their maneuvering skills. Gender knew what his report would say. He also knew it would be rejected. Redesigning the Zero to include armor and self-sealing tanks would require 6 months of engineering and retooling. Japan was already losing the industrial war. There wasn't time, but he had to try. What Gender didn't know, and what would only become clear after 3 days of testing, was that the Corsair's advantages went far beyond protection. The aircraft represented a completely different philosophy of air combat, one Japan couldn't counter with tactics, courage, or even improved pilot training. The Americans had built a weapon that negated everything the Zero did well. On February 16th, Gender conducted performance tests. Japanese engineers had repaired the fire damage and fabricated replacement instruments. The Corsair wouldn't fly, too risky to test fly an enemy aircraft without extensive preparation, but they could run the engine and measure its characteristics. The R-2800 roared to life at 0730 hours. The sound was different from the Sakai, deeper, angrier, violent. Gender stood 50 feet away and felt the vibration in his chest. Test pilot Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, not the famous ace, a different man with the same name, sat in the cockpit making measurements. Sakai was from Osaka, 26 years old, with 280 test hours in captured Allied aircraft. He'd flown P-40s, F-4Fs, even a damaged P-38 before its engine failed. He understood comparative performance instinctively. Sakai's first observation was throttle response. The R-2800 went from idle to full power in 3.2 seconds. The Sake required 5.7 seconds. In combat, those 2.5 seconds decided who lived. Next, climb rate. Using propeller pitch data and engine power curves, Sakai calculated the Corsair could climb at 890 feet per minute at sea level. The Zero managed 750 feet per minute, marginally slower, but close enough that superior Japanese pilot skills could compensate. Then came the numbers that changed everything. Maximum speed at 19,000 feet, 417 miles per hour. The Zero topped out at 331 miles per hour, an 86 mile per hour advantage. In aerial combat, 86 miles per hour was the difference between predator and prey. Diving speed. The Corsair's structure could withstand 5G loads during pullout. Testing captured Zeros showed the airframe failed at 6G, and most pilots experienced diving blindness, loss of consciousness caused by blood pooling away from the brain, at sustained speeds above 420 miles per hour in a dive. The Corsair could dive at 470 miles per hour, make a firing pass, and pull out with enough G-force to collapse a Zero's wings. American pilots weren't braver. They had an aircraft that could safely execute maneuvers that would kill Japanese pilots attempting the same tactics. Sakai climbed out of the cockpit at 13:40 hours. His face was pale. "Commander, I don't know how our pilots are surviving at all." Gender nodded. He'd reached the same conclusion measuring the aircraft's structure, but he had one more test to conduct, the armament. February 17th. So it's in 15 hours. Gender examined the Corsair's 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns. Each gun weighed 64 pounds and fired 750-850 rounds per minute. Combined rate, 800 rounds per minute. The Zero carried two 20mm Type 99 cannons, 60 rounds each, 520 rounds per minute combined, and two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns, 680 rounds each, 900 rounds per minute combined. On paper, the Zero's 20mm cannons had the advantage. Each shell weighed 5 ounces and exploded on impact. The 50 caliber rounds weighed half an ounce and didn't explode, but numbers lied. The 20mm cannons had an effective range of 275 yards. Beyond that, the shells dropped so rapidly that hitting a maneuvering target was nearly impossible. The 50 caliber guns remained lethal to 800 yards. In a diving attack, an American pilot could open fire at 600 yards, hit a target at 400 yards, and break away at 200 yards, all before the Zero pilot could return effective fire. More critical, the 50 caliber rounds were armor-piercing incendiary. They punched through aluminum, then ignited magnesium on the other side. One round hitting a fuel line could set an aircraft ablaze. 6 guns firing 800 rounds per minute created an 80 round per second stream that didn't just damage aircraft, it disintegrated them. Gender calculated hit probability. A Zero needed 12 to 15 seconds of sustained fire to destroy a Corsair. A Corsair needed 2-3 seconds to destroy a Zero. In combat, whoever fired first won. And because the Corsair was faster, climbed better, and dove faster, American pilots always fired first. The conclusion was inescapable. The Zero had been designed for a war that no longer existed. In 1941 to 42, battles happened at low altitude where maneuverability mattered. By 1944, American radar and superior climb rates allowed fighters to position themselves above Japanese formations. The battle ended before the dogfight began. Japanese pilots weren't losing because they lacked skill. They were losing because physics didn't care about courage. Admiral Ozawa arrived on February 18th. Gender's report was 43 pages, typed on a salvaged American typewriter captured in the Philippines. Every page was a confession of failure. They met in the hangar. Ozawa was 58, gray-haired, exhausted. He'd commanded carrier operations at Midway, Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. He knew what defeat looked like. Gender handed him the report. "Admiral, the situation is worse than we feared." Ozawa read in silence for 22 minutes. When he finished, he walked to the Corsair and placed one hand on the fuselage. The metal was cool despite the tropical heat. "Can we build something equivalent?" Ozawa asked. "No, sir." "Can we modify the Zero?" "Not without a complete redesign, 6 months minimum. We don't have the resources or time." "Can tactics compensate?" Gender paused. This was the question that mattered. "Only by avoiding combat entirely. Our pilots must refuse engagement unless conditions are absolutely favorable. That means letting bombers through. Letting American aircraft attack our positions without opposition. That's surrender in everything but name." "Yes, sir." Ozawa sat down on a toolbox. He looked old suddenly, ancient. "How many pilots have we lost?" "In the Solomon Islands theater since November 1st, 217 fighters, approximately 180 pilots. American losses are 31 aircraft, 19 pilots. And you're telling me that ratio will get worse?" "Yes, sir. As their pilot training improves and more Corsairs reach the front, I estimate the ratio will approach 14-1 by late 1945. The number hung in the air like smoke. Ozawa stood. "I'll forward your report to Naval General Staff. They won't believe it." "I know, sir." "What happens when they ask for recommendations?" Gender had been thinking about this for 3 days. The answer was ugly. "We need to stop sending Zeros against Corsairs. We need to preserve our remaining veteran pilots for defense of the home islands, and we need to accept that we cannot win air superiority over Allied forces." "You're recommending retreat." "I'm recommending survival, sir. What we're doing now is systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation." Ozawa looked at the Corsair one more time. "This aircraft represents everything we don't have: industrial capacity, advanced metallurgy, excess power, the ability to protect pilots even at the cost of performance. We designed the Zero to be light, fast, and maneuverable, because that's all we could afford. The Americans built the Corsair because they could afford to make it perfect. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Commander, do you believe we can win this war? Gender chose honesty. No, sir. Not against this. Ozawa nodded. He left without another word. The report would reach Tokyo on February 24th. Naval General Staff would file it under tactical assessment and continue sending Zeros against Corsairs for another 18 months. 180 more pilots would die before the war ended. What the Japanese test pilots discovered matched combat reality almost exactly. Between February 1944 and August 1945, F-4U Corsairs achieved an 3-to-1 kill ratio in the Pacific Theater for every Corsair lost in air combat. 11. 3 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. By mid-1945, as American pilots gained experience and Japanese veteran pilots were killed or reassigned, the ratio approached 14-to-1. The Corsair accumulated 140 confirmed air victories against 189 losses, a success rate unprecedented in aerial warfare. But Japanese commanders never modified their tactics. They couldn't. Modifying tactics required either developing aircraft competitive with the Corsair, impossible given Japan's industrial limitations, or refusing combat, politically unacceptable. So they continued sending Zeros against Corsairs, hoping courage would overcome engineering. It didn't. Japanese aircraft production actually increased in 1944 to 45. They built 28 180 aircraft in 1944 compared to 16 693 in 1943. But production didn't matter when every aircraft was obsolete before it left the factory. The Americans understood something Japan's leadership refused to accept. Industrial warfare wasn't about honor or courage. It was about mathematics. The side that could afford to protect its pilots, maintain equipment superiority, and replace losses faster than the enemy eventually won. Every time. The Corsair proved this theorem in blood. After the war, Admiral Ozawa testified at the Strategic Bombing Survey. Investigators asked him when he knew Japan would lose the war. February 1944, he said. When I saw what American engineering had created, I understood we were fighting a war we couldn't win. They asked him why Japanese forces continued fighting for another 18 months if defeat was inevitable. He had no answer. Commander Genda survived the war. He returned to Hiroshima in September 1945 and found his family's farm destroyed by the atomic bomb. His parents were dead. His younger brother was dead. The city was ash. He moved to Tokyo and worked as a technical consultant for the Japan Self-Defense Forces, helping rebuild Japanese military aviation from nothing. He never flew again. He died in 1989 at age 84 from lung cancer. His obituary mentioned his role at Pearl Harbor, but didn't mention the captured Corsair evaluation or his attempts to save Japanese pilots from obsolete aircraft. The report he wrote in February 1944 remained classified until 1978. When American historians found it in captured Japanese archives, they called it the most accurate enemy assessment of American aircraft produced during the war. Every prediction Genda made, kill ratios, tactical disadvantages, pilot losses, proved correct within 5% margin of error. Nobody thanked him for being right. The 180 pilots who died after his report was filed didn't know he'd tried to save them. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya's daughter Emiko grew up in Yokohama. She married in 1964 and had 3 sons. Her mother, Yuki, never remarried. Emiko learned about her father's service when she was 16 from a letter he'd written before deployment. It arrived 12 years after his death, misrouted through 3 postal facilities. The letter said, "I hope to come home and teach you to read. We'll visit the bookshop where I grew up and I'll show you my favorite books. Please grow up strong and curious." Emiko became a librarian. She retired in 2004 and still lives in Yokohama. The captured Corsair was destroyed by American bombing in March 1944. Only fragments survived. The Japanese test pilot's notes and measurements were packed in waterproof containers and hidden in a cave near Rabaul. Australian forces found them in 1947. The documents are now in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, Display Case 14, Section 3. Most visitors walk past them without stopping. There's a small plaque. It reads, Japanese Technical Assessment of F4U-1 Corsair, February 1944. It doesn't mention Commander Gender. It doesn't mention Lieutenant Commander Itaya or the 217 pilots who died. It doesn't mention Admiral Ozawa's question about whether they could win the war or Gender's answer. It just shows the numbers. 11. 3-1. In the end, that's all that mattered. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Not for us, for men like Commander Gender who tried to tell the truth and weren't heard. Subscribe to this channel so these forgotten stories reach more people, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Did your family serve in World War II? What stories do you know that should be remembered? Thank you for keeping history alive.